Remember, you are being broadcast. Hold on a moment here while it loads. Luann, will you confirm for me when the live stream begins?
It's on.
Got to wait until it pops up for me so I can mute. Okay.
We're ready to go.
Yeah, give it, let's wait until 3:30. Okay.
All right. This is the Executive Committee of the Dunn County Board of Supervisors. And welcome to our 3 new members, Kelly, Diane, and Brian. And let the roll show everyone is here. Should we do a roll call so people know who's here?
I can call out if you will all unmute so that when you can answer, be heard when you answer. So Supervisor McCullough.
Here.
Supervisor Johnson.
Yes.
Supervisor Quinn.
Here.
Supervisor Steen.
Here.
Supervisor Jim Anderson.
Here.
Supervisor Morehouse.
Here.
Supervisor Tripp.
Here.
Supervisor Headland.
Here.
Supervisor Maves.
Here.
And Chairman Bartlett.
Here.
In attendance, we also have County Manager Paul Miller, County Clerk Julie Wathke, Corporation Counsel Nick Lang, HR Director Heather Murray, and Chief Financial Officer Keith Stry, as well as with IT Luann Domes. Is that everybody?
I think so. Okay. All right. Welcome again. We've had to call a roll, so approval of the minutes.
I so move.
Supervisor Anderson, move approval.
Okay, Supervisor Steen beat you, so he'll make the motion. Supervisor Anderson seconds. Any discussion on the minutes? If not, all in favor of the minutes, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried. We'll go right into staff reports. 4A, review the draft of the May 20th County Board agenda. You've had that sent out to you, and County Manager Mr. Miller will go over that.
Okay, first and foremost, the draft that you were sent was in anticipation of an in-person meeting. We are going to conduct it remotely. So the agenda will be adjusted to reflect that it will be a remote meeting via Zoom. That also means that certain elements that would normally be on our agenda if we were meeting in person will not take place, including oral presentations of the annual reports from 3 departments and oral reports of the standing committees. I will, under my comments for the meeting on May 20th, talk about the disclosure of interest. Hopefully all of the supervisors have turned in their required disclosure of economic interest by that date. But if not, I will bring it up and remind people. We will go over the purchase orders in excess of $40,000. There's one other item I may address, COVID-19 as well. As far as the reports of the departments, the ones that will be in your packet, again, there will be no presentation, but they will be there for you to read. You'll receive it hopefully tomorrow, the packet, have plenty of time to look at it and be able to ask any questions you may have. Those departments are Child Support, Register of Deeds, and Veteran Services. As I said, we won't do the reports, the oral reports from the chairman of the standing committees in the interest of time. And then the action items that are there for executive committee and that are coming from the other standing committees are going to be addressed in this meeting. So is there any elements that or any items that anybody feels should be added to that agenda or any changes to that agenda?
Sounds like there's nothing, so we can probably move on to COVID-19 update.
Okay. And I don't have a lot to say beyond what you have all seen in the email blast that I've been putting out 3 times a week. Excuse me. That's a allergy, guys. That's not COVID. The one thing I do want to point out is we're getting more and more questions, and it's understandable about when we're going to start opening county facilities to the general public. Right now, under COVID-19 rules, we have restricted public access to the county buildings to appointments only. And where somebody cannot receive the service or the program remotely over the phone, over the internet, where there needs to be face-to-face. And in those cases, the member of the public does make an appointment. They're met by the person who's made the appointment. There are screening questions that are asked to make sure that they're healthy and not exhibiting any of the symptoms of COVID-19. They're escorted into the meeting, and then they're escorted out, and then there's cleaning of common services after that. We anticipate maintaining this through the end of this month. So we are tentatively looking at June 1st for when we might make changes. But even in that case, the changes are likely to be allowing maybe more public access, but still perhaps requiring people to be masked when they come in. The point of the masks, again, for everybody's reminder, is not to protect them from us, but to protect everybody from you when you wear a mask. So those kinds of things are likely to be part of it. There is a meeting of key staff members this Friday to talk through the actual practices that we're going to implement. So the upshot is tentatively June 1st for perhaps some change to county facilities, the use of county facilities. We will continue as a county to need, however, to avoid creating situations where it encourages mass gathering of people. We've already seen in some areas around the country where there has been a relaxation of the standards and groups of people have come together. There are resulting spikes in COVID incidences that in some cases are simply having to go back to what they were doing before. So if we can avoid that and avoid putting an undue burden on our health system, including our local public health department that has to do the contact tracing on every positive COVID-19 case, we want to do so. That's the update on COVID-19.
All right, moving forward. Any questions on that before I move forward? If not, consideration of actions to be taken by the executive committee, presentation of annual department reports and reports of standing committees at the county board meetings. Now, County Manager Miller and I have had some discussion about this, and Mr. Miller felt we should discuss it further at executive here to see how our executive committee feels that when we get back to normal, whether we should go back to the old way, say, of having oral reports, or do we want to keep them written? So it's open for discussion.
Mr. Chairman, may I?
Supervisor Morehouse.
So I'm the newbie on the committee and open my mouth first. Anyway, I've always found both extremely helpful. But I understand that the written departmental reports contain a lot of information and are very helpful, and I'm happy to agree to that. Just given our committee structure, given our committee structure, it's really hard to keep some sort of sense of what are the issues that are affecting the whole county and affecting our constituents. And it feels to me that it's really hard to get that information. And so the committee reports for me provide some of that. And I guess for my own purposes, I would rather spend 15 extra minutes in a county board meeting because it would make me feel that I was performing more effective governance by being better informed.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Supervisor Johnson.
there's got to be a reason why this has been brought up. Is it just because of time? Is that the only reason, or?
We'll let Mr. Miller respond to that.
As the chairman indicated, he and I had a discussion about it. Supervisor Johnson, yes, it's primarily about time, which is also translates to resources. The oral reports, oral presentations of written reports can take quite a bit of time, as you know, when the information is right there in written form. Although it's nice to hear from the representatives, is it essential for communication of information as part of the consideration? As for the oral reports from the standing committees, I agree that it is useful to hear those reports, but part of what we want to do is emphasize for supervisors that there are other opportunities to hear that same thing. For instance, here at the executive committee meeting each month, there are oral reports from each of the chairmen of the standing committees. And then of course, there are minutes that are produced for every public meeting, every meeting of the standing committee, which are published on the county's website. And we want to encourage supervisors and all other interested parties or individuals to utilize those minutes. So since we do have those other opportunities, the oral reports at executive, the minutes on the website, it can be construed that yet another presentation by the chairman of the standing committees at the county board is duplicative and ultimately costs the county money in terms of time and resources devoted to that presentation.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Supervisor McCullough?
As you all know, I tend to be on the ultra brief end of the spectrum for committee reports. And if we could consistently get committee reports down to the things that are not just routine business, I can see some utility in continuing those. My problem is that we often spend 15, 20, 30 minutes on minutia that probably aren't something we need to look at the county board level. I want to know what's going on with the standing committees, but I'm much more interested in the things that are unusual for this particular meeting.
All right. Any other speaking? Supervisor Steen, I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Dave.
Okay, and Supervisor Quinn also has his hand up. So go ahead, Supervisor Steen.
Yeah, we addressed this issue at one of our executive board meetings prior to the election, and I thought it was productive. And if the committee reports contain themselves to actionable items and a brevity of reports, which I think was exhibited after we talked about it, Paul, I'm in favor of the reports. I think it's a good opportunity for the public if they're there. I realize there's other ways for them to find out, Paul, but I guess I'm old fashioned in some ways. I think it's a good opportunity, and it's a good opportunity for our department leaders to address the board and public. It helps introduce them to the board and also to the public. And I think the way we've been doing it is the way I would like to keep doing it. And thank you for your time.
Supervisor Quinn, you're muted. Or do we have him muted?
He is muted.
Okay. There you are.
Well, you unmuted yourself and then muted it again, Supervisor Quinn. Supervisor Quinn, you're still muted. There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank Tag here. I think this policy refers to departmental reports. As Supervisor Steen said, we had talked about trying to have more brevity in the committee reports, which I think we started doing. But I think the department reports, I think it's important to have them. Personally, I think it's important to have them live at the meeting. In the past, we had talked about a strict time limit on them because they had gotten longer and longer over time. And for a while that seemed to work, but again, I think maybe that discipline has eroded somewhat. So I would be in favor of keeping them, but I think if we could go back to really emphasizing to staff that we want a presentation that's only no more than 5 minutes long, let's say.
Supervisor Tripp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that in most cases, the committee reports, the standing committee reports, probably simply reading the minutes of the meeting would suffice. In a lot of cases, for example, the minutes of the Judiciary and Law Committee are going to talk about personnel issues. We're always short of people. There are going to be some standard kinds of things from the sheriff. But occasionally, and I think this is probably true of all the committees, there will be issues where a little bit of dialogue is going to be greatly enlightening, and I would hate to lose that. I made the remark, Supervisor Steen mentioned that we had brought this up at a previous meeting, and I had mentioned that I think that in most cases, at the executive committee meeting, the chairs that are sitting here today could tell you whether there's something that they really feel compelled to talk about at the county board meeting. And I think those things in most cases could get right in the agenda. So where the agenda for the county board says committee reports, you could probably list the committees that plan on doing some speaking. And as an example, let me offer this. Dunn County is not doing it, but one of the questions I had for the sheriff is if our jail was following the example of some others in the state releasing certain prisoners to get them out of the jail during this COVID-19 pandemic. If that were the case, on the one hand, you could report that in a committee meeting minutes. On the other hand, that's the kind of thing that might benefit from some discussion at the meeting. So I would hate to see the standing committee reports go away entirely. But I do agree also that we need to be, as committee chairs, we need to be judicious, we need to be thoughtful, we need to be considerate in terms of what kinds of things we choose to discuss, how we present that so that we're not taking a lot of time.
Thank you. Any other speaking?
Supervisor Mays has his hand up.
Supervisor Maves.
Yes, thank you. I actually think, yeah, we need to refine the time limits a little bit, but I actually like the department reports because it puts a face with a name, and it helps, at least when I was a newer member, it helped me realize who was working or running which department, etc. But I do think we need to look at time constraints. So that's my input.
Okay. Supervisor McCullough, do you have something else?
Yeah, I realized that I had addressed the standing committee's part of it, but not the department reports. And I agree that with the department reports, particularly when you're a newer member, it's a very valuable way to attach a face and a personality to the appropriate department. But again, I think we need to look very closely at pretty tight time limits.
Thank you. Any other speaking? Speaking to some of the other supervisors that are not on the executive committee, and especially probably Supervisor Kinnear has expressed this, that he's pointed out to me many times that we have 10 meetings a year usually. So to spend a half hour or so per meeting for committee reports, if we can keep them at a reasonable length, isn't terrible or out of the question. So I think I do agree that they are important. I think both of the committee reports and department reports are important. I've kind of changed my mind on that a little bit, speaking with some of the other supervisors. So I don't know if we don't need a motion on this. We just some directive, and I guess maybe a thumbs up that we keep the committee reports and the department reports going with a reasonable time length.
Let me ask, if I may, Mr. Chair, how does the committee feel if here at executive, since we do get an oral report from standing committee chairs, if at the end of each such report, that committee chair indicate whether or not they want to be able or have something to present at county board? I'm thinking along the lines of Supervisor Tripp's suggestion. Is there any appetite for that just being a regular part? So when we come to the Neighbors Committee, Supervisor Johnson will make a report on what activities, if any, summarize or highlight from the meeting of the Neighbors Committee, but they can also say whether or not whatever he has to say is worth sharing or bringing up to the full county board. Doing that at the executive, we could simply make a record of which standing committees said, yes, I'd like to make a presentation about this to the county board, and we can list them on the agenda as Supervisor Tripp suggested. Is that something anybody is interested in?
And that, before I hear from the other supervisors, that would probably make our corporation counsel, Nick Lang, feel a little bit more at ease. His concern was that sometimes we bring things up that aren't on the agenda. In this way, it would be on the agenda. So if somebody else wants to speak to that, or if they all are in favor, that's fine. Supervisor McCullough.
Yeah, that sounds very reasonable to me. I mean, there's not an enormous amount of point in saying, oh, and we've had routine operations. But if the people who want to speak to something more than that note it, and it's in the agenda, that would be both a time saver and a better way of keeping the record of what's going on.
Anybody else want to speak to that, or are we comfortable with that? I would say if we're comfortable with that, let's see a thumbs up like that. Looks like we, Supervisor Quinn, Supervisor Steen, did you have your thumb down too? Up, okay. So Supervisor Quinn was the only one that was down that I saw. So I guess that's what we'll try. Should we?
Supervisor Quinn wants to speak.
Supervisor Quinn, would you like to speak on why you think putting it on the agenda is a bad idea?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I couldn't find for the life of me find the my glasses on. Couldn't see the raise my hand thing. But here's my concern: is that we had a long discussion about this very topic not more than a month ago, 2 months ago, 3 months at the most, in person, and decided to not take this action, instead to go forward as we were. And yet now it's come up again, both the department and the committee reports. And I'll sort of go with the sentiment that the chairman expressed before about we only have 10 meetings a year. If we can discipline ourselves to only present the information that's been discussed and been agended in the committee in a timely fashion, then it gives us all a chance to hear the same information, and it gives more supervisors an opportunity to speak in the meeting and share their personal impressions with the other supervisors. Just builds collegiality and a sense of shared democracy, I think. Not a big deal, but that's why I would support keeping them doing it.
Am I wrong? But I was thinking if a chairman wants to speak at the county board level, and they would let us know at executive, and that would be on the agenda, then we would be safe in having questions back and forth from the other supervisors on those reports. I was thinking that would be a advantage to putting it on the agenda. Maybe Mr. Lang would like to answer that.
Yes. If the subject matter of the report or the discussion is on the agenda, then you're allowed to discuss it a little, in greater detail. Otherwise, I have advised to really limit the reports to things that have already occurred in public meetings that are a matter of record, or possibly things that will be coming up at a meeting and will be on an agenda in the next week or two, and just limit it at that and not engage in a lot of discussion. But if it is listed in the agenda, then it can be discussed more freely.
I guess that's what I was thinking with Supervisor Tripp suggestion, is that I wouldn't have to limit or say, no, we can't have questions on the reports, that we could have some discussion on these committee reports. That's what I was thinking of. Any other speaking to this? Supervisor Steen.
Yeah, I was just thinking here, like for instance, Brian Johnson's going to be discussing the neighbors. Now that's a high buck debt load that we have there, and there's a lot of interest in that. And I think it's important that we know how things are going there. Another department that is a high impact department, or can be, is the Sheriff's Department. I lean, and I'm going to change my vote back to a thumbs down. I lean towards the more information we have, the better off we are. And we have some, for instance, the neighbors, it's a big debt. And whatever happens there, staffing or whatever happens, it's important for us to know that. I just think the more information, the better. And Kinnear probably had a good idea. Spend a half an hour, 45 minutes once a month to be up to date on what's going on. I think is well worth it. You can't have too much information. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may I?
Yes.
I think in deference to Supervisor Quinn and Supervisor Steen, I'm going to change my thumbs up to a thumbs down. I think this is a governance issue, and governance is enhanced with information. And I guess I don't see any reason why we can't devote whatever 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and appropriate with appropriate discipline to finding out what the major issues are that all of the 9 standing committees are dealing with. I think it's important.
Okay. Anybody else want to speak to this?
Quinn has his hand up.
Tom, Supervisor Quinn.
Thank you. Well, you raised a point that I hadn't fully considered, and that's the advantage of being able to have back and forth conversations. It seems like we do that to a really limited degree currently. So I can see that as the only reason that I might support this, but I would still, my inclinations are still towards not limiting it that way.
In the past, I've been directed to try to limit that or stop that as much as I could. So I think that's why we have had not much discussion. Supervisor Tripp.
And
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The executive committee takes place a week before the county board meeting, and I'm sure there would be exceptions, but they would be rare when a committee chair does not know at the executive meeting what kind of topics they might want to bring up at the county board meeting. So to get on the agenda at that point, to use the executive meeting as a sort of a sounding board and to request a committee report at that time, I don't think in most cases would limit anybody's ability to bring up a topic and discuss it at the county board meeting. And as it's already been pointed out, that allows us then to take some questions and to do a little bit more thorough examination of the question. I mentioned the sounding board aspect of it before. I sometimes think out loud by articulating something like this, and that helps me to clarify it in my own head. And doing that at executive seems to me would be a pretty effective way for me to determine whether I think it's something that's appropriate for the county board meeting. So generally, I don't think that there are many opportunities where it would limit our ability to bring something up. Having said that, I'm sure that it'll happen, but I really don't see it as very limiting, but I do see it as a way around Corporation Counsel's concern about bringing things up at the meeting and discussing them that really are not on the agenda. So I think if we were to use the executive committee meeting as a sounding board, either to determine as a committee chair whether to bring it up at county board or not, I think that can be pretty effective without limiting our ability to talk about those things.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Anderson, I cut off Supervisor Quinn when I switched to Supervisor Tripp, so I'll let him talk first and then you, Supervisor Anderson.
No, that's okay, Chairman. I'm fine.
You're
yeah.
done? Okay, Supervisor Anderson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we as executive committee have had great discussion here, and listening to all of you has been very thoughtful. I have had one experience that I want to share with you. After a report at one of our county board meetings, I had somebody from the press come to me and want clarification. And it was quoted then in the paper. And I appreciate that because I felt that if we had a report that the public needed to know, we wanted accurate. And this was a chance for somebody from the press that's in our audience at all meetings. And I think on Zoom now they will be listening. And I'm assuming they're going to pick up on this and we're going to read it in the paper. And I'm always concerned about what we read in the paper. Is it accurate? Was it what we read rather than a misquote? And I think these reports that we give need to be done. But I totally agree also. We can be as brief as well, we can be as brief sometimes as Kelly has been.
Any other speaking? Well, we're kind of mixed. It's pretty close to half and half here, so I don't know. I don't know how to proceed here.
Mr. Chairman, if I may
Mr.
recommend, what we will do, what I'm hearing is we do want oral presentations of departmental annual reports, but have the managers more restrict themselves to the 5-minute rule. We can do that. I'm also hearing that there is interest in hearing from the committees. I'm going to suggest that we can poll the standing committee chairs at executive as to whether or not they want to make a presentation at the county board. Maybe every time it'll be yes, and we'll stop the polling, but there's nothing wrong with asking an executive if you want to, on the off chance that someone it says, you know, my committee didn't meet. There's no need for me to say we didn't meet. There's nothing to report. Or we met, it was informational, there was nothing, it was business as usual. There's no need for a report. It simply creates the option before the county board takes place for that chair of that committee to say there's no need for a report. So I think that doesn't compromise the positive things that I've heard expressed about the oral reports from the standing committee chairs, because those still will take place every time a committee chair has something to say. If that's amenable, that's kind of my takeaway from this.
Supervisor Anderson.
No, Supervisor Tripp.
Oh, Supervisor Tripp, sorry.
Thank you. If we do nothing in terms of changing ordinances, we can continue on the way we are, but we can also implement this plan at executive committee, right?
Right.
Yes.
Okay, then that would be my suggestion.
And I'm leaning towards that too. I think I would like to at least give this a try when we get back to normal, hopefully next month, but whenever it is, and we start having meetings in person and we start having reports again, I think I would like to give it a try about the chairs of the standing committees coming up with an agenda of what they're going to report on, because over this last year especially, I have heard from our clerk, Julie Wathke, and Corporation Counsel about all the times we came close to the line or we crossed the line. And even though I tried to limit the discussion, I think I'm not trying to, I don't want to say that you can't report. I just want you to say what you're going to report on. And I agree with Supervisor Tripp that the meetings are close enough together. They're usually only 1 week apart, that we should be able to know what we're going to report on at executive. So I would like to at least try it for a couple of months after we get back to normal and see how that works. If it doesn't work, we can stop, but I'd like to try that. Is that okay with everybody?
Supervisor McCullough has his hand up, but he's muted.
Yeah, I was waiting. It occurs to me that we need to think about transit and fair board and some of the things that have occasionally reported during that committee time, and whether we need to ask those people to submit something for executive board if we go with this. Just, there are a couple of committees that do not fit the general structure. So,
and I agree that there's 3 of them. It would be solid waste, fair board, and transit that we would also include in asking. Is that sound okay to try that? If it does, we'll move on. Okay. Looks like it. Okay, thank you. Moving on, consideration of reports, resolutions, and ordinances to the county board from the executive committee. Resolution authorizing a FY budget adjustment, FY 2020 budget adjustment for solid waste and recycling program. Supervisor Miller would like to speak to that, please.
I appreciate the promotion to supervisor first and foremost.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm
Darn, it's been rescinded already. Short tenure. Thank you. Yes, you've got in your packet both a draft resolution for the budget adjustment. This is to cover the projected shortfall in revenues versus expenses for the remainder of this year, 2020, due to reductions in fees from tipping fees from hauling, reductions in recyclable value that we're getting on recycled materials, continuing costs associated with staffing and with the facility that frankly is deteriorating. At this point, we're projecting a shortfall in revenues of approximately $330,000. So in order to maintain solid waste and recycling program on a modified schedule of services where each of the 8 remote sites would be open on Saturdays for 8 hours, while the transfer station remains at its normal hours of operations, along with drop-off, also public drop-off at its normal hours of operation. The Solid Waste and Recycling Board requested this budget adjustment of $330,000. The Planning, Development, and Regulations Committee, which is the oversight committee for the board, forwarded that recommendation yesterday at its meeting, requesting that budget adjustment. The executive committee acts as the finance committee for the county board and is charged with considering this. And if it concurs on the budget adjustment, forwarding it to the full county board for action. Also in your packet related to this issue is a staff report from your county manager and your chief financial officer recommending against this budget adjustment for reasons that are laid out in the staff report. The staff report, the county manager and the chief finance officer felt it was important to consider this budget adjustment in the broader context of the county's fiscal situation. The reality is that we have in Dunn County, we still have a fairly high debt per capita load that we're dealing with. We have existing operations that either annually or potentially annually go over projected budgets despite our best efforts. In particular, we are still supporting the operations of the neighbors to a tune of $1 million plus above and beyond projections. And that's even with adjusting every year because the cost of staffing, nursing is becoming very scarce and very expensive to provide. So that's an ongoing expense. We never know when something associated with one of the programs of human services might suddenly experience a spike in costs. That occurred in 2018, where we had to adjust. The adjustment ended up being in the $600,000. And then there is COVID-19, the costs associated with it that we have yet to realize any revenues for, despite the talk about monies being distributed by the federal government and the states, along with the projected downturn in revenues. As of this point, the latest report I heard is that the state of Wisconsin sales tax is already down by, or projected to be down by $1 billion. The projection right now for reduction in our budgeted sales tax revenue is between $400,000 and $600,000. Then there is the solid waste, the recycling industry itself, which has been in crisis since 2017 when China changed its rules regarding how much and what kind or quality of recycled materials it would receive. China was the biggest recipient of American recycled materials. In 2017, they substantially changed the standard for contamination, and it resulted in 40% of the global market disappearing. The United States is not set up yet to handle its own recycled materials. And so the price we get for those recycled commodities has tanked to historic lows. In the past, the monies that we would get for recycled materials was helping to support the operations of the solid waste and recycling program, which among other things features these remote sites that we operate around the county that makes it convenient for residents to bring their waste and their recycling. Those remote sites are expensive to maintain. It's an expensive model. And with the downturn in revenues due to the recycling market, the downturn in revenues due to reduction in waste being hauled to our transfer station and the increase in costs, the outlook for solid waste and recycling under the current model and even under the modified model that's being proposed by the Solid Waste and Recycling Board for the remainder of the year is bleak, to say the least. So the professional opinion that we wanted to avail the executive committee of from your county manager and your CFO is that all these things in total, in consideration, make this something we would advise against. The alternative would be to direct the solid waste and recycling program to adjust its operations so that it is operating in the black, that we projecting what revenues it has, how would it have to curtail operations so that it does not require a support from the general fund. Bearing in mind too, the general fund, we've been working it down the past several years. We're still under the levy limit law, which restricts our ability to raise property taxes to cover increasing costs. The value of average net new construction has been lagging behind the cost of CPI, the increasing CPI, which is a cumulative effect that is slowly drained down our fund balance. It's at the minimum levels that we need to maintain a good credit rating, and those credit service agencies are already beginning to question that trend. So when we go out as a county to bond to borrow for capital improvement projects, et cetera, we are facing the potential for lower credit ratings and thus higher costs for all the citizens, since bonding is also something that ends up on property taxes. I've attempted to summarize these points in this staff report. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers and information at you, but the bottom line is it seems a perfect storm of bad situation where this has come up, and we're being asked to support the solid waste and recycling program to an estimated tune of $330,000. It may be more, it may be less, but it may be more, with the idea that we could get paid back. The general fund would be paid back next year by a rise in per capita fees for participating municipalities that pay in to support solid waste and recycling. Even that's not guaranteed, because each of our agreements with the townships allow, with a 120-day notification, those townships to drop out of our program. We could face a potential where the city of Menominee or one or more of the townships say, we want to become our own responsible unit. We're not going to participate. That lowers the total number of persons involved, the per capita, which puts a greater burden on the remaining ones for the per capita price to be high enough to cover the anticipated costs. And it does run the risk of becoming a domino. You raise it more can drop off. The sustainability of the program is definitely in question. I apologize for the length of my dissertation here. I will note that Morgan Girk, the director of our solid waste and recycling program, is on this call. If you have any questions, Keith Stry, the CFO, is also here. And I'd like to conclude mine by inviting either of those gentlemen, if they have anything to add to what I've said, for the executive committee's consideration on this budget adjustment.
So do either one of you want to chime in, add something before we start the discussion?
This is Morgan. I think Paul summed it up very well. He covered all of the points that I was prepared to cover for you as well. There is our residents are very, very desirous of keeping the collection sites open. It's been a historic model that's been very successful and appreciated by our residents, but to Paul's point, very expensive to run that type of model. There are not a lot of communities left that run fully manned and full service collection sites. It's very expensive. So there are alternative business models for us that we could possibly look at, ones that eliminate collection sites but still provide full solid waste and recycling services throughout the county through some different ideas. But nobody's in favor of that, because they're very, very supportive of wanting to keep these small collection sites in these backyard municipalities. It's so convenient for them and valuable to them, and I understand that and respect that. So we just don't generate the revenues, for the reasons Paul stated, to keep this going without some help this year. My board has motioned at our meeting yesterday to move forward with a request for referendum at the end of the year, should this be approved and should we continue forward. That would help. If it was passed, it would help with some of the capital needs that we have. Paul indicated we have a 30-year-old transfer station that is in dire need of replacement. So there are some other options we can look at, but unfortunately, the one that everybody wants to sustain is the one that costs the most and has the most risk. So I would just echo Paul's sentiment that there is a lot of risk associated with this because our intergovernmental agreements simply allow for 120-day notice for municipalities to pull out, and that we would not be able to recoup those per capita next year to pay back the deficit. So that's all I'd add.
All right. Any discussion? Supervisor Steen.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Morgan, if this is not approved, then what does our outfit look like going forward next year? What do you, I mean, how are you going to address that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So essentially that would mean that we would fold as a business. We would begin winding down sites and services with an eventual closure. There are some residual capacities that we could entertain. If what would likely happen if we say we're getting out of this program, we can't support it anymore. What would likely happen is the municipalities are still responsible to form RUs, responsible units to deal with recycling. And I think they would coalesce into groups. And we have 8 collection sites, fully equipped collection sites throughout their municipalities. So I'm sure that they would want to take those collection sites over, purchase our equipment, the hydraulic compactors, the oil tanks, et cetera, the office equipment, and run that on their own. So at that point, the county could function, if the municipalities desired, we could function as an administrative responsible unit where we still take care of all of their annual regulatory reporting that's required, all of their educational outreach, and all of their compliance associated with their recycling program. And that's something that many of the municipalities that are considering pulling out of the program, and there has been discussion of that already because of costs, I think they're unprepared for the level of administrative oversight that's required and the financial oversight that's required to get all the materials hauled in and out of these sites and staffing, et cetera, et cetera. So to answer your question, we would start winding down and discontinue services and programs in the county.
If I may refine that very quickly, this budget adjustment is for the remainder of this year. If we don't pass this budget adjustment, solid waste and recycling is required to adjust its operations to stay within the projected revenues it has. That would mean limiting or eliminating hours of operations at remote sites, some or perhaps all of the remote sites, in order to stay within the budget for the year. What it doesn't say, in answer to Supervisor Steen's question, is what we're going to do going forward. And in fact, that's a huge part of the conversation that's happening at the staff level and at the Solid Waste and Recycling Board. What will we do going forward beyond this year? So I'm hoping that this committee, while that's an important question, the key question is, what about this year? And what about the prospects if we use general fund, which is limited and shrinking? What about the prospects of being paid back? Should we approve this budget adjustment? That's where the committee needs to focus its attention.
I have one observation, I guess. And Morgan, if you could break this down, you probably can't right now, but what would each municipality's piece of the pie cost them? I'm pretty sure that most municipalities do not have any money to do this. In all honesty, I think I'm evaluating it right. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, and that's part of the talk we've been having with municipalities. Their budgets are stressed like everyone else's, and they're kind of left with the choice to repair their roads or participate in the program. So the per capita fees have historically been undervalued, and I want to make sure everybody understands that. The collection site model has always been fully subsidized through the sales of recyclables and tipping fees. So the public has never seen the true cost through per capita of what it takes to maintain this program. Now that they're seeing that, they're certainly, taking into consideration whether or not they can do it on their own, whether or not it makes sense for them fiscally to continue in the program. So each municipality's per capita is going to see a large increase, more than double in 2021. And that's probably going to be enough of a catalyst to drive many of them out of the program. Now, we're talking about, possibly looking into our intergovernmental agreements and creating some binding language in there if they want the collection sites to remain open. If we get past this stage of the deficit and the municipalities agree to stay in, we might be able to lock in some agreements through a binding intergovernmental agreement where we know we're going to have per capita not hemorrhaging from our budget from people leaving. But we have to get to that phase first, and if we don't get through the deficit portion of this year, then we won't be able to go on past that.
Supervisor Headland.
You're muted, Vaughn.
There you are.
All right, okay. Thank you. I guess my question is, we have run at times at least reduced number of sites. I know we're kind of running that way a little bit now. We've changed some hours. Just my personal experience, last weekend I was at our site here just out of Boyceville, and it was like Grand Central Station. It was this absolute steady flow of cars in and out, from people, times there were 2 pickups backed up to the mulching pile, loading mulch. Most of the materials that have been brought out there for compost are almost all gone already. And then, of course, the steady flow of everything from garbage to old refrigerators or whatever was being brought in. I don't think we can go without having a program. Obviously we can't. And I agree with Mr. Girk and I agree with Mr. Miller. We have not funded it personally or at the per household level that we probably should have been, but because of the fact we were getting by with the cost of recyclables, certainly that took care of it. I think that people would come with the proper push from the committee saying that, look, there is no more time. We either come up with binding, agreements that we can go forward with a program, with a plan that'll work for everybody, or, you're all going to have to go to private collection and that's it.
All right, thank you. And a little bit of information, the proposed plan with this deficit would be that the satellite places like Connorsville, Ridgeland, Downsville would open back up just on Saturdays for 8 hours a day on Saturday. So that should, I would think, take a little bit of the traffic from places like Boyceville, Colfax, Elk Mound, and the transfer station a little bit, take a little bit away from them. Any other speaking? Supervisor McCullough.
So a question that I have over the longer term, I mean, I realize that we're looking at right now is this budget, but over the longer term, if this service is going to continue, and at some level, I think the citizens of Dunn County want that, how much would it cost if we close down now to reopen? What's the opportunity cost? If it's 300,000 in bridging and it's $1.5 million to reopen in 2 years, that's saving $300,000 now and sticking ourselves with a $1.5 million bill in 3 years is not a great plan. So I'd like to know what the balance is there.
The upshot, if I may, is that we we need to consider going forward past 2020, whether or not we continue with a model that has those remote sites. So it may be that what we have to present to our partners, the townships, the cities that are participating, is that we need a new model. We need a better model. The one that we have had with 8 remote sites and the transfer station is no longer fiscally sustainable. We need a new model. There are such things, Morgan alluded to them, one where we would build a new transfer station and everybody through the county would cooperate, and we'd have curbside pickup across the entire county, which eliminates the need for remote sites. So it isn't necessarily the case where we're looking at a scenario where we close some or all of the remote sites this year only to face reopening them next year. I'll let Morgan address or correct me if I'm wrong. If we were to do that, if we were to close some of them or all of them this year and then reopen them in January for some period of time, my anticipation is that there would be little cost beyond the cost of operating them again. The sites can be secured and there would probably be some cleanup because there are the inevitable law breakers, if you will, scoff laws, who will drop off materials even though sites are closed. Those will have to be cleaned up. But the cost of reopening is fairly nominal. Morgan, am I wrong on that point?
I think you're mostly correct. I think there would be some costs, obviously, in mothballing for a time. But I think that the most intrinsic loss that would, very likely occur is our municipalities, our participating municipalities, would find another way for themselves, and so there would be no one to come back to the program should we open it again. And Paul alluded to a new transfer station model. That's another whole conversation, future conversation. Our facility is 30 years old, and that's another, an entirely an additional large capital investment to the tune of $10 to $12 million. That's a discussion we would have to have down the line as well, because our facility is literally end of life. The amount of corrective maintenance money that we spend to keep it functional rises every year. So I think there would be some costs if we were to approach a closure of the program temporarily, but I think the long-term casualty of it would be there'd be nobody to come back to the program.
And if I may, one more thing, Mr. Chairman, if I may. Okay. Here's the bottom line. I think that executive committee members need to consider. So we're being asked to approve. You're being asked to approve a $330,000 budget adjustment. That decision needs to be made fully aware that we may not get it back. There's no guarantee that that money, once dedicated, will be returned to the general fund in the future. The goal would certainly be to do so. The effort will be made to do so, but we need to consider this as an expenditure that will not be replaced.
And Supervisor Johnson.
Yes, Morgan, I was wondering if you were to just keep Elk Mound, Colfax, Boyceville, and Menominee open, say, I don't know if you can extend the hours to 10 hours. Could you break even throughout the rest of this year?
No, Supervisor Johnson, we could not. As a matter of fact, the deficit would climb. We've already looked through those metrics. We've looked at keeping those 3 sites open, which I call the principal sites, and the transfer station public drop-off. The deficit balloons past that point. So even at the 330,000 deficit, that's a Saturdays only model for all collection sites, with the exception the transfer station public drop-off would continue normal hours. So we could not do that.
Okay. Why is that? If you were going to close, if you were to keep Ridgeland, Sand Creek, Connorsville, Downsville closed, why would that climb? Because you just kept the other ones open. I don't understand.
Well, it's because we're not only talking about a staffing component here. We're talking about losses in other areas as well, and expenses that we're going to see by the end of the year.
Okay.
Yeah, and we've done as much as we can to reel in those costs. We've canceled our clean sweep event for 2020, which is unfortunate but necessary. We've canceled some yard waste services or the extent of yard waste services that we provide. So we've been cutting every cost we possibly can while still maintaining a Saturdays only model at the direction of the Solid Waste Recycling Board. And
Okay,
it's,
thank you.
yeah, you're welcome.
Supervisor Headland, do you still have your hand up, or is that from before?
No, just reiterate that, and I think Mr. Johnson probably just got the answer from Mr. Gert, so thank you.
Okay. I guess I wanted to mention, being a town chairman, I've looked into the private sector a little bit. And as a township, we could go by ourselves. The private sector, it would cost more money than what we are paying now. I don't know if it would cost more than what the per capita fee is going to be next year. But I do know that the services aren't going to be near as great. The private sector recycles the things that the state of Wisconsin says has to be recycled: paper, cardboard, plastics, glass, tin. It's single stream recycling, and you would have we would have dumpsters at our town hall, and we would have dumpsters there for recycling. The thing that bothers me is, when I grew up and I used to hunt out in the country, I'd walk through the farmlands and come to a ravine, and I'd find junk in a ravine. We're going to have a whole bunch of things that Dunn County is recycling right now that we can take and get rid of, and the private sector doesn't do that. So we're going to have to, as townships, find a place to go with that stuff. And it may be Eau Claire or someplace a distance away from our township. Well, what's going to happen to our countryside? We're going to find things that aren't recyclable and things that cannot be put into the solid waste, into the dumpsters, are going to be put someplace on the land. That's what I'm afraid of. So I'm convinced that we need to try to stay in this business at least throughout this year. We also have, at the beginning of the year, when we went out with our per capita, we led the townships to believe that we were going to be in this business for this year. But I think going forward for next year, it's going to be totally different. And maybe someday, if we move ahead and we have a new transfer station, it'll be totally different again. But I do believe that right now we have to continue this service, or environmentally we're going to have a chance of going backwards, taking a huge step backwards in our being environmentally safe. Any other speaking to this? Supervisor Maves?
Yes, thank you. And I agree with what you just said, and I would like to thank Mr. Miller for putting together his staff report here. What he said in there is absolutely true. But I also reflect back a year ago, or a little over a year ago, the town of Menominee was looking to go it on their own. And I'm sure, as a matter of fact, I know they did their legwork and their due diligence, and they determined that it would cost them more to go with a private pickup and leaving Dunn County. And the fact that they came to that conclusion makes me really want to know what the rest of the whole Dunn County feels. And so that's why I'm very supportive of supporting this at the 330. and having a referendum this fall. And that would not only keep us in business this year, perhaps we need to make some modifications, but it'll give the towns time to go out and do their due diligence and make the public aware of what's really going on in the true cost. So even though I do understand that it will put us at a risk as far as future borrowing, etc., this comes down to one of those, what are our priorities? And to me personally, it's to keep the land clean. And so that's why I am in support of the 330,000 request at this time. Thank you.
Supervisor Quinn. You have to unmute yourself.
Never learn, sorry. Thank you. I want to share those last two comments especially. I also think that moving forward on this is a good idea. I was also at the local site last Saturday, and it was amazing to see the use that our community was making of that site. The recycling part of it, also the yard waste, the compost, and the chippings, all being used by lots of people. But I think so that I think there is a risk here, but we really need to support this, and then we need to take on the responsibility of having a engaged and thoughtful and difficult discussion in our county about how we want to go forward. But this is necessary in order for us to have the time for that.
Thank you. Anybody else? I don't see anybody else.
Do you need a motion?
Yes.
I do.
I'll make that motion.
All right.
I'll second.
Supervisor Morehouse seconds. Supervisor Quinn made the motion. Any other discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried. All right, that was good discussion. Thank you. Moving forward. 6B, resolution authorizing the issuance and sale of the not to exceed 14,280,000 taxable general obligation healthcare center refunding bonds, series 2020A. And I think we'll start with our CFO, Mr. Stray. Yeah, you're still there. Go ahead.
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you recall, the last several months, we've talked about a potential refinancing opportunity that came to our attention in January in meeting with our municipal advisor. County board, with the executive committee's recommendation, did authorize the issuance of debt in approximately this amount. But there was also the caveat that it didn't bind us to issue the debt that when we went to market or to do a direct offering, which was where we ended up as an approach. If it didn't make sense for us, we didn't proceed forward with it. And that was the case. So after we didn't go forward with that reissuance, and it was really a factor of the COVID-19 in the market reaction to that since. Just unfortunate timing. In January, things looked fantastic, and then things went south after that. However, having said that, after that did not work out, had a conversation with our municipal advisor as well as our bond counsel to talk about our options going forward. Certainly, this is a refinancing, so it's not new money debt. It's really just an opportunity to take debt that we can call the bonds in 2022, in April of 2022. This was doing it in advance to realize the initial estimate was approximately $700,000 to $750,000. That's a significant amount of savings, obviously, to the county. The notes that would be refinanced were issued at 4% interest. Right now, interest rates are considerably less. So it still is worth looking at this, but looking at it in a lens that in more and more normal market times. So in conversation with municipal advisor and bond counsel, this was an approach that's very commonly used in organizations that issue debt quite often for refinancing. Your larger counties and cities that have a large portfolio will pass what's called essentially a parameters resolution. And that's what's in front of you.
I'm on a Zoom meeting.
Essentially what it does is it establishes the minimums to move forward with authorizing actually doing the refinancing, closing the sale more or less. In this case, we utilized what was the original projections in January when the market was stable, when interest rates were stable, as kind of a benchmark, and felt it was very comparable. So our municipal advisor and bond counsel put this resolution together with us, for us to talk through and present to you as an option that if it would be approved by the county board, would authorize the county manager and chief financial officer that if these minimums, or even better, were achieved, the authority is granted to proceed forward with the sale. This provides us the tool that, because the market can swing a little bit more than normal, which I think is no surprise to anybody. I know we talked about that at county board, that if the right opportunity comes up and we've got a buyer of our bonds, or we have the opportunity to do a direct negotiated sale that meet these parameters or exceed them, do better, we would achieve the savings of $700,000 to $750,000. So this is not unusual. This is something that's very common in the industry. The county has refinanced debt before and has utilized this tool at least 2 times in past years. Our bond counsel's been with the county for a number of years and did have recollection of that. So that's why this is presented to you again at this meeting with updated estimates of the amount that would need to be borrowed depending on the scenario. There's multiple factors that go into this, but this bottom line, that if these minimums were met, the county would expect to see anywhere from $700,000 on up in estimated savings. If that's not achieved, then authorization is not there to proceed forward with the sale. So that's why it's presented to you for your consideration today.
Any questions?
Supervisor
Anderson first.
Yes, thank you, Keith. You've been very thorough in going through this with us all the time. And I like the approach. Obviously, we only meet once a month and we can't wait for us all the time. So the way you presented it and with these GO bonds, I think is exactly the way to go. And so I know a little bit about this, nothing like you do, but I'm saying, if you're basically, at one time you told us 700, 800,000 saving, and then last month it dropped and we understand why. So if we approve this authorization, you would wait until the bond market was about right, and then you were able to jump into it without waiting for further approval from us. Isn't that correct?
That is correct. One
And
of
then
the
I'm
major,
all for it. Then I'm
Yep.
all for it.
And one of the major benefits really is because the market is a lot more fluid
volatile.
at this point, at this time. Thank you. Really, it gives us the opportunity that if these minimums are met, we have the ability to exercise a sale without having to wait for the next county board meeting, which, depending on timing, could be anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks,
Right.
and the opportunity lost. So that's really one of the major incentives here, but yet it puts parameters and restrictions on us that if we don't achieve that minimum savings, we don't have authority to move forward.
Supervisor Steen.
Yeah, Mr. Miller and I had a discussion about this, and I guess I'm against giving any authority to spend, encumber, or commit county resources to any person prior to the approval of at least the executive committee and preferably the entire board. I think it is a matter of fiduciary responsibility for us as a board to handle it in that respect. I'm not against, if it would be the executive board that would have to approve it, I don't think it's that hard to have a meeting, call a meeting. I think you need 24-hour notice. Is that correct, Paul?
That's correct.
For us to do that. And this is nothing against Keith or nothing against Paul. I just feel that kind of shutting the door after the horse left the barn, that don't make any sense to me. And I think that the board should be aware and be okaying what happens prior to, not after. That's my thoughts. Thank you.
Supervisor Tripp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I understand correctly, this is money we have already borrowed and spent. Is that correct? And the resolution now is simply to refinance that current debt to take advantage of a lower rate?
Right.
Thank you.
That's correct.
Any other questions or speaking to it?
Supervisor Headland.
Supervisor Headland. I don't see him.
He raised his hand on. Vaughn, you're still muted.
Supervisor Headland.
This is not extending the period of indebtedness at all?
That's correct. We're actually not allowed to extend it. In fact, I believe that is one of the parameters that was included in here in the resolution. So essentially what it would be used for is if the market conditions change to the point where we can meet these minimum requirements of savings, we would have to operate within the terms originally in place for the original bond issue from 2012, meaning that we wouldn't be able to extend it beyond the end date on what we'd be refinancing. But certainly, again, it gives us the ability to move quicker and but yet achieve the savings.
Anybody else? Supervisor Anderson again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could respond a little bit to Supervisor Steen. I don't see the risk that you do. What we've done is we're approving our CFO to move ahead under the guidelines that we've already set. And if we wait even sometimes 24 hours, the market can change. Certainly, I don't think we can react that quickly to this. So what we're doing here, what we're doing is saying, here's the parameters. And when it reaches that level, you don't have to wait for 2 days or 3 days or everything. We've given you the authority now, and we know that that will be a smart, fiscal, financially responsible thing to do. And I don't think we have to worry about that at that time because we know what those parameters are. So I'm all for this way.
Any other speaking to this?
Supervisor Tripp.
Supervisor Tripp.
Do we need a motion to recommend this to the county board?
We do.
I so move.
Second.
Supervisor McCullough seconds. Any other speaking to the resolution? If not, all in favor say aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
All right, the motion passes. Thank you. 6C, resolution authorizing acceptance and expenditure of federal and state COVID-19 reimbursement funds. Could our CFO, Mr. Stray, explain this again?
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you recall at the last executive committee meeting, I did point out that I would be in contact and working with Corporation Counsel Lang to talk about options when it comes to COVID-19 dollars. We're hearing all these conversations about money that's potentially flowing from the federal government, from the state government. And it could come in multiple forms. It could come in various methods and approaches. And we've already seen that. We did receive a stimulus payment, direct deposit just out of the blue. And it was determined through an allocation, but that was a separate deposit. In other cases for human services and health department, we've seen it as existing programs receiving supplemental or additional funding. But then in all cases, I believe there's been additional hooks and restrictions on the use of the funds. There's also conversation about additional dollars. So it's a work in process. The bottom line is, in talking with Corporation Counsel, we couldn't necessarily request under the statutes more or less a budget adjustment to say, well, any and all money that comes in we could just automatically adjust the budget. That's kind of and I figured that would be something that we couldn't do under the statutes, and Corporation Counsel confirmed that. However, this resolution at least would document, if it's approved by the county board ultimately, that departments can receive funds for COVID-19 and be allowed to use them in general. And then myself as CFO and the county manager would come back working with departments at the end of the year with a final budget adjustment to reconcile all of this so that the county board has a final accounting on that, and the county board ultimately does have to approve under the statutes any adjustments to the budget. So what this does, it allows departments to continue utilizing these funds, but it doesn't potentially flood all the standing committees, executive and county board with all of these individual sources of money that are beginning to come in. I know there's been conversation, there's a balancing act here, but this is a very unique time. First time in my career I've seen all of a sudden new money coming up pretty much from multiple ways. And we want to be able to have a situation where departments have the support they need to utilize the funds during this COVID-19 situation. So that was the intent on putting this resolution together. Corporation Counsel Lang has reviewed this, what I put together, as well as County Manager Miller, and we're recommending you pass this on to the county board.
And if I may add one thing, just for clarification, it's not that we've received a whole bunch of money. We haven't yet. We may receive more funds. There's certainly a lot of talk about it. The details of it, even the amount of money that the state of Wisconsin has already received, still have not been resolved. Anytime you talk about huge amounts of money, you can expect huge amounts of hands reaching out for it and a lot of red tape. But to summarize what Mr. Stry is saying, by this ordinance, we're not going to be in the position where we have to come individually to each committee as each drib or drab or even substantial amount of money comes forward, but rather can do it all at once at the end of the year.
Supervisor Steen had his hand up first, Supervisor Tripp, and then I'll get to you.
No, I'm all right. Paul took care of me.
Oh, okay. Supervisor Tripp then.
In the first resolved paragraph, it authorizes departments to proceed with making necessary expenditures relating to operational adjustments as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Is there a way to define exactly what that is? Or would departments have some discretion in determining what is an adjustment due to the COVID-19? It strikes me that that's a little bit open-ended, unless there's some kind of a definition of exactly what that means.
I think it's deliberately open-ended because we don't know what those standards will be. In fact, that's a big part of the conversation. We can fully expect that any monies that are sent by the federal government through the state are going to come with strings attached. Some of them may be tied to specific COVID-19 expenditures. And we are every department is tracking its actual extra costs related to COVID-19, whether it's in personnel over time or time devoted to COVID-19 even during regular hours as opposed to what we would otherwise be doing, or purchase of actual equipment or PPEs, et cetera. So we're already doing that. But the problem is there's still no clarity as to what is going to qualify and what is not. So the language that's in this resolution is deliberately vague so as not to cut off the possibility that something we hadn't anticipated may qualify.
And that's really kind of my question, because the implication, at least the way I read it, is that the operational adjustments for expenditures would be made before any kind of financial reimbursement might come from the state or federal government. I know that the state of Wisconsin has asked counties to keep track of the expenditures related to COVID-19. I think there is some intention, both on the federal and the state level, that at least some of these expenses be reimbursed. I'm still a little bit nervous about the open-endedness of that paragraph. Yeah.
If I could, Mr. Chair, I can add a little bit more to that.
Okay.
Certainly, I understand the concern, and as your CFO, I was kind of being very deliberate in that language, crafting that and discussing it with County Manager Miller. But he is correct. In the short time frame that we had to turn this around in some cases, and some of the operational adjustments that had to take place, for example, to get staff set up to work remote, there were expenditures. These Zoom meetings, these licenses were not included in the IT budget or operational budgets. Those are some examples. The overtime, if there is any for certain areas, public health probably didn't have COVID-19 in their 2020 budget. In fact, I know they didn't. So, these are the types of things, the gamut of these are pretty wide. Now, having said that, early on, we did converse with the COVID response team, talking about tracking forms, ICS 214 forms that are being provided to emergency management in the event that we're able to claim reimbursements through FEMA. We can also use that for tracking expenses and going back to that. At the end of the day, the department still will only have so much money that they're authorized, and if they don't receive federal or state reimbursement funds, their operating budget will still have to make them whole at some point. So they're still going to have to monitor budgets all the way through. One of the things that we did do to assist departments, as well as help with accountability and tracking, is we established a separate COVID-19 expenditure account. And we're asked non-personnel. So we're asking people, and we've advised people to put those expenditures there specifically so that we can much easier report versus having like headphones and trying to dig through the whole chart of accounts to find where those individual expenditures are. So we're trying to take reasonable steps here, but in the limited amount of time, and even now, it would be hard to really project all the unanticipated expenditures in different areas and different types. So that's why that was intentionally written that way.
And finally, I will add too that I appreciate the concern about it being very open-ended, but none of our departments is operating in a vacuum. There is quite a bit of vetting that goes on with all the adjustments that we have been making in response to COVID-19. So I think it unlikely that any one department or division will utilize this to go and do unnecessary or unwise changes in terms of expenditures and operations in response to COVID-19 without it having been fully vetted through our public health department and administration.
Thank you. I
Supervisor
appreciate that.
Steen.
And it helps to kind of put it all in context. I appreciate your answers. And by the way, there's a typo at the end of that paragraph.
Supervisor Steen, did you have something, or were you just waving before?
I was just waving.
Okay, Supervisor McCullough.
It would seem to me that while the language is a little bit vague, it's actually quite a bit tighter than the authorization we gave with the emergency declaration. So this is actually tightening our restrictions, I think, more than loosening them. I'm entirely for it.
All right. Any other speaking? Do not see any. If not, we need a motion for this.
So moved.
Supervisor McCullough moves, Supervisor Steen seconds. Any other discussion? If not, all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, motion carried. Let's see. 6D, resolution in support of the Hmong community. Speaking to this, I will ask Supervisor Tripp to speak to this. He asked for this to be on our agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I'd like to do with this resolution is deal with it the same way we did with the resolution to put the mapping question. I'd like to bring it to the executive committee today, give you some time to think about it. And if you agree that it's worth going forward on, I will work with the Corp Council to develop a specific resolution that we can bring up next month. But I wanted to get some sense of where people stand on this to begin with. The resolution you see in your packets came from the Eau Claire School District. Eau Claire County passed a similar resolution. And basically what it is, it's a response to the federal government's intention, their stated intention to deport about, well, the numbers vary, somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 people, Laotian and Cambodian descent to the country of Laos, because the people in question are living in the United States. They are not citizens and they have some sort of felony conviction. The problem with that is that it is commonly believed that if they are deported to Laos, they will be put to death. These are people that are basically under a death sentence. There has been some reaction to this in the Eau Claire newspaper. There is an editorial in opposition to this, which I will supply to you if you decide to go forward with this. There has been some national attention, and I have to confess that I have not spoken personally to anybody in the Hmong community about this, but those people who have spoken to their Hmong neighbors and friends tell me that this effort by the federal government has greatly agitated that community. I think any resolution that we would consider would be in support of anything that helps to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the Hmong community in Dunn County. We could put together a resolution that either does or does not mention the federal efforts. And I think, if I have read the situation correctly, that the Hmong community would be appreciative of a voice of support for them in a manner like this. But again, my intention was to bring it to you folks first to see if it's worth pursuing. If it is, we'll get a specific resolution put together by next month and we'll talk about it formally then.
Any other speaking? Supervisor Morehouse.
I am totally supportive and thank you, Jim, for going forward with this. I'll look forward to a resolution that's more relevant to the county. But yeah, I think this is very important to do. I support you.
Any other speaking? Questions?
Mr. Headland has his hand up.
Supervisor Headland.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and the rest of the committee here. I really looked at this thing strongly and thought, you know, every time some little political thing pops up, we look for a resolution. But I liked Mr. Tripp's comment that, you know, maybe there's a possibility we should not mention going against our federal government. I think that resolution in support of this community, many of the local churches step forward and help sponsor, bring those people into our area. And we certainly want to show that we still support them. Thank you.
Any other speaking? If you want to look up some information, you can go on to the internet, of course, and just type in Trump's plan, and you get all sorts of information. You can, if you dig deeper, you could find out what the felonies or the convictions, whatever that are deportable offenses. So if you want to look into that deeper, you can for a future meeting.
Supervisor Tripp has his hand up.
Mr. Chair,
Supervisor Tripp.
I'd just like to make one more comment. The fact is that some of the people that would be subject to deportation are probably pretty nasty people. But I think that a resolution such as the one we're talking about could offer support to the local community without defending those people who really, are probably kind of bad guys. Secondly, I think that the people identified by the federal government are not necessarily all bad guys. Some of them do not have citizenship because they are elderly and have chosen to retain their citizenship in the hopes of eventually returning home. So it's like many things, it's kind of a mixed bag, but again, working with Corp Council, I think we can put together a resolution that supports the local community and does what we want it to do. Thank you.
Supervisor Quinn.
Supervisor Quinn.
Well, I support moving forward with this. I'm wondering what kind of a motion we need to consider action on.
A motion would be appropriate.
I don't think we need a motion today. We would wait until we have the resolution in front of us.
A motion would be appropriate to put on the agenda or to direct staff to prepare the necessary resolution.
Okay, we could have a motion to direct staff to prepare a resolution.
That's
I will
what
so
I was
move.
thinking. I'd make that motion.
And who
I'll
is the second? Supervisor Tripp?
Yep.
Any discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right.
Opposed? Motion carried. All right. Moving forward, review of reports, resolution, and ordinances coming to the county board from the standing committees. So Committee on Administration, resolution adopting the Families First Coronavirus Response Act provisions. Speaking to the resolution, Supervisor Headland, maybe? Or if you're not prepared, I'll.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just give a rundown, and if people want further, I'll let them ask for more. Basically, this was in response to the fact that when the president created the Families First Act, certain changes were needed to take place in terms of who was allowed to take leave and what those parameters for reasons why they could take this leave from their work. And basically it was all in response to family members being affected by it. And so we need to actually, in a sense, go back and agree that we're able to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speaking? Any questions? Not, this is just a report, so. All right, then, moving on. Facilities Committee, resolution regarding the 2020 Dunn County Fair. Speaking to the resolution, Supervisor Maves.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, on May 6th, the facilities committee had a meeting with the fair board. It was a special meeting called, and the topic of discussion was what to do about the 2020 Dunn County Fair. And there was a very good discussion by all members. The fair board brought forward a lot of good ideas. The facilities committee had responses, questions, and I thought it was a very good discussion at the meeting. A final motion was made to recommend the cancellation of the grandstand activities, the carnival activities, and the commercial building exhibits. And that recommendation passed and is what is being forwarded on to the executive committee today for their considerations and actions. Since then, I have had discussions with other people talking about, well, why didn't you cancel the food courts and the food and blah, blah, blah. And my only answer was at that time, that was not part of the recommendation. And so the recommendation was, as I had just stated, the cancellation of grandstand, carnival activities, and the commercial building exhibits. So that is what's being forwarded today for discussion.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes.
Supervisor Maves didn't have the opportunity to direct me, so I made an effort at putting together a resolution. I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope. Select a window. Let's see here. Here it is. I'm going to share a screen with you. This is the now therefore that I have put together, and it's important, I think, that the executive committee read this over with me. Now therefore be it resolved, the Dunn County Board of Supervisors hereby order that the 2020 Dunn County Fair shall consist only of 4-H related activities that can be conducted remotely, that all other elements of the fair, including but not limited to events that take place in the grandstand, the carnival, the food trucks and booths, display and contest booths, and use of the commercial building, and any and all such activities that involve groups of people gathering in close proximity shall not take place, and that no activity associated with the county fair shall be open to the general public. Now, that's the way I drafted it. Supervisor Maves indicated that there was discussion about the food trucks and the booths. This drafting was also in consultation or in consideration of the direction we've gotten from our public health department regarding response to COVID-19, and the basic premise being to avoid situations that can cause groups of people to gather in close proximity, which would include food trucks or food booths, which is why I've added that. That having been said, if it's consensus of the executive committee to change any part of this now therefore paragraph, this would be an opportunity for you to chime in.
I can't see your, so I'm gonna have to,
Here, I can stop sharing my screen.
okay.
I think I can stop sharing my screen. I'm not sure how to stop sharing my screen.
Up
Maybe
above
Luann,
on the top.
got it. Stop share. I see it. There it is.
All right, if somebody wants to see that again, or the wording, speak up. I realize sometimes we don't remember the exact wording after just a few minutes. But anyway, Supervisor Anderson, you have something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do agree that this is an important issue, and I'm glad to have it come forward right now. I would point out that 4-H is the majority, but is not the only youth organization that comes to our Dunn County Fair. So we need to make sure, are we excluding the FFA organizations? Are we excluding the other youth groups? Because we only mentioned 4-H. The other thing is that we always have that open next to the fair office. And are we saying that nothing can go on there? There's so many things. And when the fair board met about this, I wondered if they took everything into consideration There's each stands there put on not by the others, but for the Farm Bureau, for example. The 4-H has an each stand right inside the commercial building. All kinds of things pop up to me and wondering, is this allowable now or is this not allowable? And so I just bring that up as a question that I have.
All right. Any other discussion?
Chuck. And
Supervisor Maves and then Supervisor Johnson had his hand up.
Yes, Mr. Chair. There was a lot of discussion as far as the other groups, what Mr. Anderson just spoke to. And the whole intention was to still have the fair for the youth. And they had all kinds of ideas as far as streaming the showing and the judging. So they would bring the cattle in the morning, they would judge them, and they would stream the judging so the parents and grandpa and grandma could watch them, at home on the streaming. And so the whole emphasis is basically to hold the fair for all the 4-H and the youth and the kids, not to deprive them from their hard work and their labors. As far as the food stands, that's something totally was discussed. And but just the fact that this week I have learned that I have some members in my family with that have tested positive. And so I really don't know if we even want to have the food stands. I realize it's money makers for these different organizations, but I really question whether we even want to have the food stands. I mean, I realize it's money makers, but what's a life worth? Thank you.
I will note that we have been told that there are other counties that have canceled their fairs entirely.
Supervisor Johnson, you had your hand up.
I think Chuck answered my question. Thank you.
Okay. Supervisor Anderson.
Thank you for one more shot at this. I would be very disappointed if we totally cancel it. I think of the meat project students, which has been pretty good. That means we can't have an auction. I mean, we need to look at the whole picture of this fair. And I don't know the answer. I wonder, is there a dead end date that we can make when we cancel this fair, or how soon, how long can we go before we say, yes, this is it, or there'll be no Dunn County Fair, or we will have a Dunn County Fair with these restrictions, and then spell them out very clearly. Is there a June 1st date? Is there a cutout date? I guess that's what I'm asking Supervisor Maves.
Well, I can answer that. This resolution isn't stopping the fair. It may end up being a virtual fair, but the fair is going to go on in some way, so that the meat projects, the other projects, maybe not all the projects. They talked about some open classes or something dropping, but definitely the fair is going to go on in some form at this point. Supervisor Maves, maybe you have more on that, but.
No, you did answer that, and the fair is going to go on, just not in a normal traditional fair atmosphere that most people are used to. And the fair board itself was questioning whether booking expensive acts in the grandstand and stuff, and then if nobody comes to the fair, then they're going to be in a huge deficit as far as financially that way. But I want to be perfectly clear, the whole fair is not to be canceled. It was so the 4-H and the kids will still have some way of displaying and going to the fair. It's just going to be with restrictions as far as where potential large crowds can gather.
And I will note that in terms of the timing, our sense is that we need to take action in May. because you wait till June, there's little time to either book or not, or cancel things that have been set up. We simply don't have the time to react adroitly if we wait to, just a month and a half before the fair is scheduled. That having been said, we can also refine the language. I'll work with Nick Lang to refine the language of this resolution to make it clear that it's not exclusively 4-H, but it's 4-H and other youth group related activities that can be conducted remotely that are going to be allowed to take place.
Any other discussion? Questions? If not, we'll have to wait and see the final resolution at county board. We don't need a motion on this.
The executive committee does need a motion to forward
Oh,
the
we do?
resolution to the county board. Yes.
Okay,
County
so
board, of course, doesn't have, can vote whatever way it wants to vote.
right. I do need a motion to move this
I
to
so
county
move.
board. Supervisor Steen moves. Or did you have a question?
No, I made a motion.
And Supervisor Johnson second. And any other discussion? If not, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carried. All right, reports to the standing committees. I realize not many standing committees have met for quite a while. So is there, I guess instead of going down through all the lists, Supervisor Anderson has his hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. After all the good discussion we had earlier, I will state to you that the CR&T committee did meet Monday. And it was more of an organizational meeting because we did not meet in April. What I would like to do is to give you a very brief report when it's time and then ask that I could give this report regarding broadband at our county board meeting next Wednesday night.
All right. We can do that. Is there any other committees? Supervisor Headland?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Got a few points that I thought needed to be shared with the executive committee. First is the fact that we had at our committee received a report from Heather Murray, our Human Resources Director, to move forward with implementing a 401A retirement plan and a 457 account changes, and to stop putting money into the OPEB or PHEHP accounts. These are, those letters stand for Post-Employment Health Plan. That one was created for management employees, and the OPEB is actually other post-employment benefits for non-management employees. And this is where unused sick time for these employees is deposited at the end of their employment with the county. We did move forward based on the recommendations, which are very favorable to go forward with development of the 401 retirement plan, or excuse me, the 401A retirement plan. Secondly, there has not been a annual review for a number of the positions within the county. And so we decided that we needed to add that to our these are unclassified positions, and we needed to add that, at least that review time for wage levels to our classified schedule. And these people consist of tax collection assistants, public works, seasonal workers, election workers, deputy medical examiners, and the deputy sheriff's reserve. So those 5 classes, we did move forward and recommend that they be added to an annual review so that we keep those wage levels at least at a reasonable level. The third thing we were asked to consider which took a lot of discussion, was that we had a very low level of credit card limit based on cards that are held by our county manager and our chief executive financial officer. And this didn't allow them to, in the times, especially of COVID-19, to sometimes make purchases of supplies or equipment as they came available and were needed, and would allow for that to have taken place, that they could be able to just put this on the credit card account. The request was for a $75,000 credit limit for the manager and a $60,000 credit limit for the CFO. What happened was that we, after a lot of discussion, did agree to change these credit limits. We asked that along with that, there be a separate report for the use of these credit cards so that they would not be misused, and we would know just when they are used and for what purposes. So this would come out on a separate report. Along with that, then, due to those reporting changes, we did agree to make those changes in those two credit limits on those two cards. That, along with the ordinance that we already discussed, is what took place at our Department Administration meeting. Thank you.
Are there any other reports of committees at this time? I realize most of you have not had meetings lately. I believe it's time to start having meetings. If we have to have them by Zoom, so be it. I understand that, at least through the end of this month, and maybe going forward, we'll see what happens in the future. But Supervisor Anderson brought up broadband, and when we were having the report of broadband at his committee, it was pointed out that even though the county board had gone through the resolution of moving to broadband forward or broadband certified, I've heard both names, that staff had thought they needed to go back to highway for one reason or another. And we've got a company in the northern end of the county that is hoping to go out to ask for loans, and that would help them do that. So they were hoping to come to the highway committee to voice their concerns on what the holdup was. And we pointed out to staff that there really wasn't any holdup, that, I pointed out that the county had ruled already and we should be doing it. So I'm using that as an example of why I feel even if we don't have business to do on our committee, that the discussion of what's happening in that department, we need to know that. We just need it. It's just it's knowledge we need. It's board engagement. I think it's time now to at least start having meetings. This is my personal feeling. I'll respect what the chairs of the other committees feel, but I guess I'm just voicing my opinion as chair of the board, that I think it's time we start having more communication. If there's anything else at this time, announcements or anything? If not, we'll adjourn, and I'll say thank you to everybody that participated, the staff and everybody, IT, and the rest of the supervisors, and look forward to seeing you next week again on Zoom.
Everybody stay healthy.
Yes,
Thank
that's
Hi, everybody.
good.